So I am here with Alyse, who I have been stalking the ish out of this morning. And what a delightful ray of light that you are. And I feel like it's the perfect time to talk with you a little bit about trauma and breath work, but also as it pertains to kind of financial abundance too, because I feel like a lot of people, self included, are feeling a squeeze at the moment and really struggling with sort of uh oh gosh, what's the opposite of abundance? It's like
Scarcity?
scarcity mindset. There you go. I was like complete blank. So I'm so glad that you're here. I kind of want to allow you to take the wheel a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could start by how you got into this work. I'm just always fascinated how people find themselves in a place to then be so overflowing that they can teach as well.
Yeah, so it's been a really long journey for me. So I actually discovered breath work when I was 19. So I'm 42 now. So it's been a long time. I was in college and I was struggling with an eating disorder and anxiety, and I was just looking for answers. Like I was just trying to figure out why I was feeling the way I was and just like how to feel better. And I discovered yoga and I started working at a yoga studio, and then they had a breathwork class there and I just did it, and there was something about it that I just felt really drawn to it, and I felt like I was supposed to learn more. So then from that point on, I pretty much did every single breathwork training that was available. We actually have an amazing breathwork community here in Philadelphia, and they do trainings and teacher trainings and all of that stuff. So I trained as a breath worker. I did four breath worker training programs, like all back to back in my early 20s, a teacher training, and I just like totally immersed myself in it at a very young age.
You sound, and not to label you, but you sound kind of like me, like type A. I'm like, I love this. We're going to do everything that's this. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I do. I'm very intense in that way. Like, I don't necessarily like think of myself as type A because I'm very abstract and not really like a logical thinker. But when I am into something, I really go all in and I immerse myself in it and I become kind of obsessed with it. So I think that's what happened with breath work. And I also just found such a supportive community, and at that age, I always joke because I was always like 10 years younger than everybody in the room. And it just was such a great experience for me. And it was like finding a new sense of family in like inside of this community that I had never had before. So it just, and, and just starting to heal and understand the deeper things about trauma and my family and all of that stuff. So yeah, so that's kind of how I started out. And then I always would teach breath work, I would teach groups, I had private clients, but I never really got to the point where I was like, okay, I'm going to start a business doing this at that time. I also was in college. I have a degree in education. And then I quickly realized I did not want to be a teacher. So I went back and I got my master's degree in counseling psychology and I became a school counselor. So I was a school counselor for 10 years. And then I started my business in late 2019. But I think, I always knew that I was able to help people way beyond being a school counselor. I just didn't know exactly how to do that. But now that I am where I am, I understand why I spent all that time as a school counselor because it really informed my work that I do now around trauma and having so much real life experience working with traumatized children paired with just my natural gifts and abilities with trauma. It's really made me be able to build a certification and a body of work that is very comprehensive. So I wouldn't trade that time in my life for anything. I feel like it was perfect and I learned so much, but I always knew that I was going to be doing something more. So, in late 2019, I just had this very strong knowing that I needed to move forward somehow. And I started working with a coach and then I started my business. And, that was right before COVID. So, pretty much I started my business and then we went home from school in March and I never went back to school. So that just kind of, perfectly worked out that way.
That's so cool. I guess one of the questions I probably should have started with for anyone who doesn't know what breath work is, would you be able to explain it? Because it's not just, I
Yeah.
think some people might be a bit confused that it's like it's Wim Hof and it's ice baths and it's kind of hyperventilating, but maybe you could
Yeah.
give a more detailed.
Yeah. Well, it's not that. I mean, it
Yeah,
is that, but that's not what I do.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And there are a lot of different types of breath work, especially now. When I first started learning it, no one knew what it was. I remember I have a friend who like she tried it and she loved it so much, and we would go out and she was like, Alyse does this thing, and she'd be trying to explain it to everyone. And I'm like, please stop. Like, no
Yeah.
one knows what you're talking about. Can we just not talk about this?
It's like breathing. She teaches people to breathe. People are like,
Yeah, and, like, at
oh,
that time, this was,
yeah.
like, in the early 2000s, like, no one like,
Yeah.
it was pointless.
Yeah, totally. They're like, we're watching what is it? Like um Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie do
Yes.
Simple Life with flip phones. We're not breathing. Yeah, we're not at that stage.
It's
Yeah.
so funny you brought up that show because my friend and I were just joking about it, and I could not remember the name of it, and I was like, "What is the
Simple.
name of that show?" Simple Life. So there it is.
Mhm.
So, yeah. So it definitely has evolved, obviously, and now people I think a lot more people know what it is, but the type of breath work that I teach is actually my own methodology that I've created, but it's based in what I have been trained in, which is called conscious connected breathing, which is a very simple breathing technique in and out through the mouth in a
Mhm.
circular pattern with no space between the inhale and the exhale. And I teach it in a way that is actually very supportive to the body versus like forcing. I
Right.
really believe that the body actually has its own natural ability to heal and reconcile everything that it needs to. We just need to give it the space to do that. So the breath work that I teach is much more about just dropping into and finding your body's own natural rhythm and then moving the breath and the energy in that way rather than forcing anything, because I feel like sometimes with the forcing or these really hard ways of breathing, it can actually create more anxiety sometimes, especially if you have a lot of trauma. So that's my thinking on it. And I couple it with the channeling that I do and the different trauma tools that I teach. And I have breath work that is very intentional for different purposes of healing around family trauma, ancestral trauma, and,
Yeah.
a lot of different things.
It's a perfect segue as if you knew exactly where I was going next. How would ancestral trauma maybe show up for someone that may be unaware that that's kind of what they're dealing with? Because
Yeah.
it's become more of the cultural conversation, especially around a lot of the anti-Semitism that's been going on. And kind of, I feel like that's where I was first sort of privy to this idea of generational trauma can be, if your ancestors were in Auschwitz or anything like that, like perhaps there is, or, well, I guess scientifically now they can prove that there is a generational trauma there. Could you kind of explain in more eloquently than I did what that is, and then how it might show up for someone who maybe doesn't have such a quick go-to of Holocaust,
Yeah, for sure. And I love that you brought up that example because, I'm Jewish,
Yeah.
and I have like explained this to a lot of people because I feel like so many people are reacting to what's happening from, and their ancestral trauma being triggered, but they don't know that that's what's happening.
Mhm.
And obviously that creates a lot of, people arguing, but they're not even sure why they're the deeper level of why they're actually triggered.
Sure.
So ancestral
And
trauma.
and I will say to that, as someone who's not Jewish, I bring up that example because I think it's tangible, and we should understand that that is perhaps the extreme to a 10, and it can appear in other ways, but also to have some grace, especially around that dialogue. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So, ancestral trauma, just to explain what it is, it's just trauma that's passed down through the ancestral line, through the generations, that it's more living on sort of like a cellular level or a level like an energetic imprint. So it's going to be less around like a specific event or a thought or a memory and more just around a physiological or psychological imprint or pattern that we're not particularly aware of, but that can surface at different times. So, it would be different than a family trauma because it is more of an overall feeling. So it can be harder to detect because people probably wouldn't even be aware of why they would be reacting to something in a certain way, like to your point, the Holocaust, or when we talk about, Jewish people and why they might be so triggered, it is, that imprint of, this huge catastrophe. And not
Mhm.
even just with that, but any huge catastrophe or traumatic situation does leave an imprint on,
Mhm.
whoever that happened to, but also the collective in general. So I think this is really important to understand. But what I will say is that I think it's really important for people to not feel daunted or overwhelmed by this idea of ancestral trauma and be like, oh my God, now I need to go figure out what all my ancestral trauma is, because
Mhm.
that isn't really helpful. And it's not something that you can necessarily figure out. However, it will come up when you need to look at it, right? And that's what I always say about all types of trauma and healing. It's not like we can just say, like, okay, I'm going to go heal my trauma and we can just like check it off of a checklist. Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah.
But it will show itself when it's time for you to look at it. And then the other piece of this too is, through a lot of the work that I do around healing family and ancestral trauma, I do find that if you focus on clearing and reconciling a lot of the trauma that you have from your family dynamics and family relational trauma, like sustained trauma over time through relationships or just what you witnessed growing up, you will end up addressing and healing a lot of the ancestral trauma through just doing that work, because most of the familial stuff that shows up in this lifetime with your parents is a result of the ancestral trauma that they are carrying. So, through doing that work, you will be able to address a lot of it. However, there will be deeper stuff that will surface. For example, like for me, when I first started my business, there was a lot of ancestral trauma, from my father's line around money and all of these different things that came up as I was moving beyond, like
Yeah.
where my parents went or what my parents did. So that will be like another layer that will come up. But I will say just one final thing about this is, if you really want to have a way that you can hold on to tell the difference between what would be like a family trauma or something from childhood versus an ancestral trauma, usually the ancestral trauma is going to be more of like an archetypal overarching energy, whereas the family trauma would be more of something like an event or a relationship or a memory, or a thought or a belief, whereas like the ancestral trauma will be more of like an overarching pattern of like lack or scarcity, for example, or an
Yeah.
overarching like fear of failure or fear of poverty or fear of something terrible happening, but like you don't know where it's coming
Mm.
from. Those types of things would tend to be more ancestral or even past life versus family trauma. So that's kind of like a way that you could quickly discern. Obviously, there's nuance to it, but just to give you like a little way that you can tell the difference.
That's interesting. I'll use an example and you can tell me when you saying that, I'm like, I think that as an ancestral trauma, my lineage from my mom's side, which I feel most like aligned with, is like this distrust of men because it's been a generational thing of like the women doing everything alone, usually sans man, like in each
Mhm,
generation. And so
mhm.
I do feel like there are things and patterns in my behavior growing up that I'm like, oh, because that is a learned behavior. Yeah, like basically that you can't trust that a man will stick around is kind of like would that be a could that be an ancestral trauma?
Yeah, for sure. And I could say that obviously that could show up also just, in the way you would have watched your mother interact with herself and the world. But obviously that's coming from somewhere. So,
Mm-hmm.
yes, for sure. If that was something that has been passed down through the ancestral lines that your mother witnessed her mother doing, that her mother,
It almost feels like a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is really
Mhm.
interesting too. It's
Well,
like,
yeah, for sure. Because if
yeah.
you have that belief that that is true, then you're going to create that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Um, so many things. When you say doing the work,
Mhm.
uh, I'm curious of what that looks like with your teaching because I know there are many different ways to do the work, whether it's just sitting with things, journaling, um, doing different sessions where you discover things. Yeah, I'm just curious of how working with you and the combination of breath work, what that looks like.
Yeah. So, well, mostly if you're doing anything with me where we're doing oh, hi.
He'll pass through twice. That's kind of like
His thing.
his thing. He'll go, I'll go this way, and then I'll go that way. Sorry, my cat just walked through. If anyone who's only listening to this, yeah.
Um,
Um,
yeah. So basically, if you're working with me through the trauma lens, which is most of the time, you will be doing my my flagship program, which is the metamorphosis, which is the body of work that I created to heal familial and ancestral trauma. So
mm,
the way that that looks is I've broken it down into a few different categories, which is birth story, which is something that not a lot of people talk about, but it's very important to look at, which is the circumstances surrounding your birth from conception up until 3 months old. So that would be the circumstances that your mother was in, the relationship with your parents, the state of the world, like what your mom was going through, what other kids she had, all of those things. And then also obviously your birth itself, if that was traumatic, all of these things, because those do leave an energetic imprint. And like I said, they won't be anything that's conscious, or you won't have any like thoughts or memories around them. It'll more create kind of like a lens through which you look at the world, or kind of like a veil that's over you of like how you see things or what you're expecting the world to be like. So I always start with my clients there on how to unravel the birth story, and then the mother, your relationship with your mother, your relationship with your father, and your relationship with your siblings. And then I have like ways for you to look at those relationships, and I walk you through drawing the parallels between the energetics in those relationships and those dynamics, and then what's showing up in your life right now. So I teach you how to find the patterns and parallels between those relationships and then your current challenges. And then we kind of like work backwards to look at what those thoughts and beliefs about yourself and the world that you created based on those relationships, and then how you can look at your current relationships and see where you're still playing those out so that you can shift them. And then I support it with breath work. So I create breath work sessions that are specifically geared towards clearing each of these specific things. So if it's birth, you have a breathwork session where I'm talking you through like bringing up whatever needs to be shifted around the birth and whatever it is that you need to know, and then clearing it from the body and the energy field using the breath. And then I give you like journaling prompts to do around that as well. And then I have a breathwork session for each different thing. And then after you go really deep into understanding these relationships and how they're impacting you, then I take you through a series of, completion and how to complete with the energy, write a new story, forgiveness, and then naturally we go into discovering, your purpose and kind of like what you're meant to do and who you really are beyond a lot of these entanglements. So that will be the way that I really take you through the process. And then how you work with me will depend on like the level of support that you get through that. Like if you work with
yeah.
me privately, I walk you through it on a much deeper level. Whereas if you do the group program, I walk you through it on a group level. And then I also have my certification where I teach you how to take people through these processes and use these tools with your own clients. So, it's been kind of a culmination
So
of
cool.
obviously the breath work that I learned at a very young
Yeah.
age, and then coming up with my own energy work to support that. And then also obviously the extensive trauma knowledge that I have. So it's kind of putting all of that together to help you move through this stuff and understand it in the most efficient way possible.
You saw me smizing pretty much the whole time that you've been talking. Um, Great drink bottle color, by the way. Something I just had like an aha moment in that where you said like the different relationships and how it mirrors and stuff in life. I have a great relationship with my birth father now, but definitely when you talk about birth story and stuff, like my whole kind of narrative around the father-daughter relationship was the one of like not feeling wanted, not, which
Mhm.
wasn't actually the reality, but that was my narrative because of the evidence that was showing up for me and the information I was privy to. And it's interesting because my blocks in my career are that same kind of energy of feeling like I'll never be loved or accepted. I'll never be enough to stick around for. I'll never kind of make it. Like, as you said, they mirror. I'm like, why couldn't I have chosen relationship with mother, which is like so unconditional, so supportive? Like, why is it that sometimes the patterns that show up are the more negative experience? Is there a reason
Well,
for that?
yeah, yes, there is. And it always is that, right? Like and the reason why is because all of our relationships will mirror back to us the things that we need to reconcile and heal in order to become the version of ourselves that we want
Mm.
to be. So your relationships will always mirror back to you the thing that you're being invited to look at so that you can evolve and move in the direction you want to move. So your relationships are literally just showing you what those wounds are so that you can move through them. And we always will be attracted to relationships that will mirror that back to us. And then that's why people are always like, oh my God, I picked the wrong men, or I always pick men that are emotionally unavailable. And it's like, no, it's just that you are attempting to reconcile the thing that you just haven't reconciled yet, or the thing that you have not looked at yet from childhood. And then the problem is that, what happens is kind of like you said, well, my father wasn't there for me, but I didn't know the bigger picture. And then when you get older and you learn what the bigger picture is from an adult standpoint, what ends up happening is you say, oh, well, I get it now.
Mhm.
And, I shouldn't feel that way because I understand why that happened.
Mhm.
But that's skipping a step because we need to acknowledge the very real experience of the 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old version of you who truly believed that she was not worthy for her father to be there. And that impacts your developing brain, it impacts your psyche, and it impacts the way that you view yourself in the world. And until you acknowledge that and fully embrace that younger version of you and bring her into the fold now, she's going to keep like tapping you on the shoulder and saying, hey,
Mhm.
I need to be acknowledged. I need to be heard. I need to be healed. I need to be reconciled. So that's why we will create relationships like that. But from an adult perspective, sometimes we can skip over that step because we
Yeah.
intellectually, quote unquote, understand. And that's why we will keep kind of banging our head against the wall or feeling like we keep coming up against the same thing over and over again.
Mm. So good. You're amazing. I don't know where time has been sucked away to, but in some kind of vortex. One of the questions I always ask my guests, and I'm fascinated to know for you especially, is what their brain looks like. If it was a picture, like what's going on up there? And I'll give you an example. Like my acting coach, he thinks his is kind of like this house that looks awesome from the outside, but there's kind of like locked rooms, and some of it feels a bit haunted, and some of them you can't get into, and some rooms are like plush and delightful. Um, yeah, what does your brain look like?
My brain looks like there's a lot going on in there.
Yep, yep.
I feel like I'm a I'm a manifesting generator in human design, and I'm like very like I feel like I have a lot of things going on at once. So I feel like my brain will be half focusing on one thing, half thinking about something else, half like tuning into the much deeper things of what's going on. Half like so I feel like my brain is like all of these different like puzzle pieces that are all kind of like doing all of these things at the same time. That's what it feels like.
I relate to that. Yeah, for doing different things, but yeah, I totally get that. That's awesome. And then just from a curious standpoint of like someone who teaches as well, like how do you, and then I'll let you go. How do you manage your energy of like giving and helping, but also reserving some for you? And I say this because you're obviously extremely successful, but I do know, and from speaking to a lot of women, like this idea of fatigue and burnout and exhaustion when you're trying to do business, you're trying to heal, you're trying to like wear all these hats. Like just so many people in my community and larger at the moment do feel at that point of burnout of like not of like needing to learn to call energy back. And I was just wondering if you have any tips for our listeners on perhaps how you do that or how you aspire to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I love that you brought this up because this isn't an easy thing to even, understand that it
Yeah.
is happening or that it could be affecting you.
Yeah.
I'm the type of person too that kind of I'm able to just like keep going. And I get really energized from my work. Like, even if I am going through something harder or there's something else in my life that is challenging, when I am working with clients or when I'm teaching or even like on a podcast, for example, like I get energized by that and I feel more of myself from that. And
Yeah.
at the same time, you have to be aware of like, doing too much will burn out your energy. So for me, I really just like to check in with myself on a daily basis of like what I need, because I think that for so long for myself, and I know a lot of people can get so wrapped up in like your routine and that being somehow meaningful of like the way you're taking care of yourself, or like I'm like meditating in the morning and like I'm exercising and I'm doing this and I'm doing that. And really allowing that to evolve and be fluid on a daily basis, like based on where your energy is and what you actually need, instead of it being like having to be this thing that you do the same every day because you think that that's like the way to be successful or the thing that's
Mm,
going to be supportive to you. So whether, and not to say you need to necessarily, like for me, I don't really want to pull back from working with clients because I really enjoy that.
yeah.
But I will check in with myself to say, like, okay, what would feel supportive to me this morning, like before I get on my calls, or what do I actually want to do with my time right now? And even though there are certain things I would want to get done, for example, if it feels better to me to like sit on my deck and like just listen to the birds, or like whatever it is that I want to do, or watch TV, like I try to allow myself to
Yeah.
have this like fluidity within my schedule so that I can honor myself in each moment versus having to be like, oh my gosh, I need to do self-care, or I need to do this, or I need to do
Right.
that. And just kind of like trusting that as more of like a evolving conversation with myself versus it having to be like this big thing of, oh my gosh, now I'm burnt out and I need to do
Yeah.
something. So I think it's just like honoring your energy in general as like a practice, and also not making it right or wrong, like what you need to do in each moment. I think that's really important because we can tend to be like, okay, well, meditating and exercising are good and laying in bed and doing nothing is bad. But like sometimes laying in bed and doing nothing is good.
Mhm.
so,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
so
that's a really I like that flexibility. Yeah, sometimes we can be too rigid with ourselves, or the guilt of like shoulds. I should be doing this. I should be doing that.
yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Hey, how can people find you if they want to take part in one of your courses, or, your Instagram is such a, great resource as well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at Alyse_breathes. Also, I have a podcast called Reclaiming Consciousness. That's a great way to find me. I do a lot of teachings and stuff on there. And then, Facebook, all of the other places you can find me as well.
That's awesome. Hey, thank you, Elise. This has been a real joy.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.